Welcome to the Grief Pod with Venetia Quick. This is a weekly podcast which looks at every aspect of something which has or will at some point affect us all. And that is grief. Whether you've lost a loved one or about to lose someone you know, or perhaps you're simply trying to help someone navigate their grief and don't know where to start or what to say, then perhaps this is the podcast for you. Each week, I'll be bringing you different stories and experiences of loss, love, hope, and at times humour. At the start of 2020, Emma Charlesworth was married. She was a working mum of one whose life suddenly turned upside down due to COVID-19 when she lost her husband, Stuart. A widow just before the age of 40, she's ensured Stuart's death has not become just another statistic of the pandemic. Through her blog, Life is a Roller Coaster, and her book, Is Daddy Going to Be Okay? Emma, you're very welcome to this week's episode of the Grief Pod.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I suppose, could we start by talking about the life you had with Stuart from the beginning, because you met quite young.
We did. So I met him when I was 15 at our local football ground. I used to go down with my granddad. He was just one of the supporters. So he'd been in my life from when I was 15. And then we started dating a few days after my 18th birthday party. I went on to joke that I just needed a date for my 18th birthday party. and the rest is kind of history, really. So I'd known him a long time. He had cancer in 2001, so we'd gone through quite a lot at quite a young age. We were married in 2005, and then our daughter was born January 2010, and that was our life, really. We were just, he was kind of had fingers in lots of pies. He was a part-time singer in bands, part-time photographer, worked, dance runs for our daughter. I worked full time as well, so that was our life.
So it was busy, and it was
busy. Yeah. Busy as most people's lives are.
And then you obviously, for everybody, COVID happened, and depending where you were in the world, different restrictions came in at different times, and different rules and different regulations and all that sort of stuff. What was the point? At what point did COVID really affect you and come into your life?
Yeah, so it was Mother's Day 2020, actually. And obviously Mother's Day changes day every year, but it was the 22nd of March. So the day before the UK was put into lockdown. And that was when he took a temperature that was slightly high. And so that, I think, for us was really, we'd had the schools closing. My daughter had been told that her dance show was going to be cancelled. She wasn't going to dance lessons anymore. So it started to creep in. But for me, it was the 22nd of March, 2020, when that thermometer showed a raised temperature. And
had Stuart been sick, like he'd had cancer? Had that left underlying health issues or?
No. So other than, it may have affected his immunity way back when, but, the cancer, as I say, was 2001. So pandemic 2020. So nearly 20 years later. So aside from that, there wasn't underlying health issues. He wasn't considered high risk because the cancer had been so far in his past. So he wasn't on that list of people that they said would be high risk. It was just a complete shock when he took that temperature. Just a complete and utter shock that what was happening on the news might potentially be in our house.
Yeah, because that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, here it was only it's sort of the schools closed. People sort of realised when the schools closed that, oh, okay, this is really a thing. Because previous to that, it had sort of been elsewhere in the world and... to a certain degree, I remember being on a radio show and we were sort of joking about Kim Kardashian or someone saying she was self-isolating. And we were like going, what is this nonsense? And then very soon it comes into your life and, the schools are closed, things aren't opening. The next day the pubs close and restaurants are, all this sort of stuff. But at the same time, it still felt like something that wasn't going to be part of your day-to-day.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, to your point there around this whole seeming surreal, you know, I can remember on the 7th of March, so, you know, 2 weeks before the temperature, we went to our local supermarket and we were doing the shopping. And it was like I'd seen on the news. So there was no pasta, there was no toilet roll, there was no antibac, nothing. You know, I remember talking to a member of staff who said that people had been buying condoms to put on their fingers because they'd run out of gloves. And it just was just this most surreal moment
Yeah.
of what is happening, like, and
Yeah.
it's not that we weren't taking it seriously, is it just felt surreal. And I think
Yeah.
that's the only word at that point, you know, when people are like, we're running out of antibac, we're running out of gloves, so we'll buy condoms to put on our
Yeah.
fingers. For
Yeah.
fundamentally, it was an airborne virus as well. I was like, that feels a bit strange.
Yeah.
So you're completely right, that's what it was like in those early stages.
So on, on Mother's Day, regular
Yeah.
Mother's Day for you, you've your daughter Rebecca, you're doing something, I assume, what started as a normal day.
Yeah, so it started as a normal day. We were playing a board game in the afternoon. That's when he first said he felt a bit warm. He was massively into board games. And, you know, but it had been just this normal day, cooked dinner, you know, it was by all manner of description a very nondescript day. You know, we didn't go out, we suspected we were all going to be put in lockdown, so I guess in a way we'd preempted that and had pretty much done that ourselves. We weren't going out, we weren't seeing people. I remember after the temperature, I drove to my mum's, which is like 5 minutes away, and shouted at her through the window because we then didn't know whether, if he had it, we didn't want to take it into her
Exactly.
house. So, you know, it reminded me a little bit of like feeding time at the zoo, you know, shouting at someone through a window. And that's how COVID really entered my world and my life started on this path that I'm now on.
So what happened then?
He steadily declined over the next week, but, you know, we watched the announcement from Boris Johnson together that we were being put into lockdown. You know, that was the following day. We watched all that, but as I say, he steadily declined over the next week. We spoke to at home.
Yeah.
He was at home. We spoke to 111 a couple of times, who basically said, yeah, it sounds like he's got it, because obviously at that point we weren't testing. You were only tested if you were in hospital. Tests weren't readily available. It was like, it sounds like he's got it, but it's not, he didn't have a cough. And this for me was the interesting thing. He never had a cough. So they were like, but, you know, you've just got to ride it out. People start to get sicker before they'll get better. So it sounds like you're following all of the, you know, textbook, if you like. Just ride it out. Just ride it out.
And meanwhile, you and Rebecca, I assume, were isolating as well, away from him.
Well,
or were
no,
you?
we weren't.
Okay.
No, we weren't, because at that point, again, the guidance was very vague, because this was so early.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think guidance and rules became very vague. And
well, they changed.
They changed
so much.
frequently.
Yeah.
And Rebecca and I were not showing any symptoms. We were not displaying any illness at all. So we weren't. And crucially, you know, Charlie, we were still in the same bedroom. And I say crucially because the early hours of what was my 39th birthday, that's when it became really serious for me. It felt, to start with, like he was having a bit of a panic attack. He was slightly delusional, which I later learned was because of lack of oxygen to the brain. And I couldn't calm him down. I tried at first, managed to do it for about an hour, and then it just wasn't getting any better. And that was the moment where I thought, I can't manage this on my own. You know, 111 have said, if it gets worse, that's when you ring for an ambulance. And it was at that point that I rang for an ambulance. And then when the paramedics tended to me, and I say crucially, because I watched his pupils dilate and his lips go blue in front of me, but the paramedics were there, so they put the mask on him. And I firmly believe that had I either not been in the same bed as him, or had I not rang 999, he'd have either died at home before I'd have even known, because I wouldn't have been there if we'd been in separate rooms, or I'd have watched him die had the paramedics not been there to put that oxygen mask on him. And all the while that was happening, my 10-year-old was sat downstairs on her own on the phone to my mum, who I'd just rung and said, you need to speak to her, because I had to be upstairs with the paramedics.
Wow. So what you thought was your husband going through the worst to get better actually was going through the worst to the end.
Yeah, 100%.
Wow. You then brought him to hospital. Or he was brought to hospital. And I assume straight into ICU or?
Yeah, so I was told that they were going to take him to hospital to ring in a couple of hours, speak to A&E. I did that. And I'll be honest with you, once they'd put the oxygen on him at home, he just got better. And he was like, yeah, no, can you sit me up? I'm a little bit uncomfortable. And so I genuinely believed that was all he needed. They were going to take him to A&E, do a once over, do a bit of a check, and then I'd be going to pick him up. Maybe that's naivety, maybe it's optimism. I don't know what it is. But so when I rang 2 hours later, that's when I learned that he'd been sedated, ventilated, and was in intensive care unit. And it was a makeshift intensive care in their theatres because their actual intensive care was full. So they'd created another intensive care in their theatres. And that was that. He was taken by ambulance. I didn't go with him. We weren't allowed to visit.
You wouldn't have been allowed to go anyway.
I wasn't allowed, no. So I wasn't allowed to go with him. We weren't allowed to visit. Everything, all the updates I was having from the hospital were done by phone. Originally, I was allowed to ring in, but then it reached a point that they were too busy. So they then controlled that they would ring family. So I'd spent, days waiting by the phone for an update. Working on the theory, no news was good news, but it was incredibly difficult to just be at home.
How long did this go on for?
So he was in total, he was in for 3 weeks. The final week he was in, we were able to Skype him every day. We were able to do a Skype call. And so he's been in hospital for 2 weeks before we physically saw him in that hospital through a screen. That's what I mean when I say physically saw him, we physically saw him through a screen. But yeah, there would be days in the lead up to that where I wouldn't get calls because the hospital were too busy. I didn't know what was happening. Trying to just be a mum, it was an awful lot to manage.
So you haven't seen him for 2 weeks. He's gone into ICU. I assume if he's up to a screen, he's starting to feel a bit better, or did it look?
He was unconscious. No, he was
unconscious. So
you
saw him unconscious on a screen?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. So you were just...
talking, wow. But he was not responsive at all. He had his eyes closed. He was unconscious the whole time we were talking to him on the screen. Whether he could hear what we were saying, I've no idea. It was incredibly difficult. And
at what point, because I know here, because my dad got COVID in hospital. He was in hospital. He got COVID in hospital, and it was very much things turn to the worst. You'll be called, and you can go in then, like obviously with tests, whatever. Did you, at what point, or did they tell you that you might get that call that you will need to come?
It was the week before he died. So the day before we did the first Skype call, I had a call from the consultant and he just wasn't responding. He'd been in for 2 weeks by that point, wasn't responding. They were trying everything they could, but there comes a point where you have to be pragmatic about it. And the consultant, she rang me and she said, has anyone told you to prepare for your husband to never come home? And I said, no. And she said, well, I'm doing that now. But all of this is being done over the phone. There's no eye contact. I literally had to come off of that phone and ring people to tell them what was happening. I had to go and have that conversation with my daughter. And no one's coming into my house at this point, obviously, because we're isolating. So no one was there to make me a cup of tea or give me a hug or pick me up or take a bit of the pressure off and say, I'll cook dinner tonight. There was none of that happening. Everything was me and my daughter just against the world, it felt like.
You get a week more.
You get a week more.
Did you get in that week? Were you allowed it?
No, so we carried on the Skype calls. The day he died, I received a call from the hospital in the morning telling me he was going to die. That they couldn't be sure exactly when, but they knew that hope had gone. And that was the first time I was offered the opportunity to go in and see him.
On the day?
On the day. So I could have gone in to see him to say goodbye. However, it was caveated with the fact they didn't have enough PPE for both of us. So the conditions that I went in would have been that I would have had to isolate away from Rebecca afterwards.
So she loses her dad, but you can't be with her either.
You can't be with her. So for me, that was a no-brainer. So I said, no, I'm not coming in. And I knew he'd have understood,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
she needed me, I needed her, and she wasn't going to lose her father and then be away from her mother. I wasn't going to have that. So I didn't go in to say goodbye. I didn't go into the hospital. We did our final goodbye call via a Skype call as well. So, and that was how we said goodbye.
You're on your own and you're with Rebecca and you say goodbye on a screen and nobody can visit the house and nobody can give you a hug and you're totally isolated. There's nothing. How did the next few days then go? Because he's in the hospital, I assume. Did you get him home? Was
he went to the funeral directors on the Wednesday or the Thursday. So he died on the Sunday and he was at the funeral directors the Wednesday or Thursday. And I think I just went ridiculously pragmatic and sorting lists and who do I need to notify and what do I need to do. And, you know, I got the call to say, Rebecca and I were in the middle of watching a film when I got the call to say he died. One of us will tell you it's Frozen. The other one will tell you it was Frozen too. We can't agree. We probably will never agree. It was a Frozen. So I got the call and I said to her, well, let's go and finish watching the film. Because I knew there was no point ringing anyone, because it didn't matter if they knew in that moment, an hour later, 4 hours later.
Yeah.
No one could come in. It didn't.
Did
really
you tell
matter.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I told her straight away.
Yeah.
She knew straight away. And so we finished watching the film. And then after we finished watching the film, I did make a few calls and then I cooked us dinner. So that's what I mean. I went through this very pragmatic, okay, well, I can't even ring.
Do what you got to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got to do what I've got to do. I can't, you know, I can't take us to McDonald's or get a takeout or whatever. I cooked dinner because I had to. And that's what I had to do, because everything was shut. I just went on this, well, I've just got to carry on. I can't not. And that was how it then played out for me.
And then you've got a funeral, which, excuse me, is normally, you know, obviously a place where people can come and say goodbye, not only to the person, but also offer support to the family and to you and to Rebecca. But you can't really have a proper, as they used to, they use the word in Ireland, meaningful a lot, like a meaningful Christmas. I mean, but you couldn't have a meaningful funeral, really.
No. We were allowed 10 people. We weren't allowed a funeral car. He had to be wheeled into the crematorium. He wasn't allowed to be carried because it would have put people in too close a proximity. Everyone was sat apart. So you had Rebecca and I in the front row, and then 2 rows behind you had members of his family, you know. And then and I can remember after a friend of mine who was there, she was like, do you want a hug? And I was like, no. Now, in that moment, I probably really did need a hug, but I was so afraid of breaking. It was almost a protection. It wasn't necessarily because of the COVID rules. It was more, if someone hugs me, there is a chance I might break and I might cry, and I don't know if I can do that right now.
Yeah.
So I said no, didn't have a hug. And it wasn't until the July, so nearly 3 months later, that somebody other than my daughter hugged me for the first time. And that was my sister, because we formed a support bubble.
And then you broke.
No, I still kept going a little bit. I did break a little bit at that first hug.
What was the point you got to where it just all came out? It all just...
There were various different points for me, but I'd have like mini breaks, I guess you might call them, but I'd always kind of pull it back because of all the restrictions. But for me, it was his memorial service 15 months later, which I held on his birthday. And that for me, I think, was the moment that I properly broke again, because I saw people that I hadn't seen before. There was a room full of people still under all of the restrictions we were under, but people were allowed to hug me, and that hugging in grief. And I suddenly was like, oh God, I can't handle this. And I'd put all of my efforts to get to that point. And it was the first time I'd actually been drunk since he had died. I allowed myself to just relax for the day. Didn't eat, drunk, emotional. And on the way home, I ended up not feeling particularly well, but I ended up clinging to a fence and just saying, I don't want to go home now. I've done this test. Can he come back? I don't want to do this. I've proved I can do it. I don't want to. And friends had to basically scoop me up off the floor and get me home because I refused to go home because I didn't want to. Because the reality of it kind of hit me 15 months later.
Came crushing down.
Yeah.
Do you, I mean, you've gone on to blog about this, which I assume you get as much support from as the support you give. Has that been cathartic for you?
Incredibly cathartic. And the blog came about, the irony is I went to university to study journalism and I dropped out after 3 months because I didn't think it was right for me. So there's a lot of irony with where my life is now. But the blog came about because I found social media really helpful when he was in hospital because that virtual support, as you say, that's what I was getting, was the support virtually. And my posts were getting longer and longer. And a few people said, why don't you start blogging? And I was like, no one's going to be interested. And then I did bite the bullet and I did do it, but I didn't necessarily write for an audience. So I didn't sit there and go, I'm going to write for people who have been widowed, or I'm going to write for people who are grieving. I'm going to write with what's on my mind today. So invariably I'd write before I went to bed because I needed to get the stuff out of my head. And it was incredibly cathartic for me to do that. But it's also, and I think it works both ways. It works for people who read the blog, but it also works for me, is that it's that sense of not being isolated, that you're normal almost with your grief and how you feel. Grief is completely unique. If I've learned anything, it's that. It's, how I feel is different to how Rebecca feels, is different to how friends, family, whoever feels. But I think there's a lot, especially being widowed young, I was widowed at 39. There's a lot of complications that come with that. And actually, just for people to go, oh my God, you've made me feel heard today. Or, I've had messages that say, I don't know if you need to hear this, but you've helped a stranger. And I think what people don't realize is when I get those messages, that helps me.
Yeah,
so you're
it is.
Right.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's, we talk about the club that we don't want to be in, but every story, there's a nugget that'll help each other because there's something in it. You also wrote the book, Is Daddy Going to Be Okay? That must have been bittersweet when that was published. Yes,
incredibly bittersweet. So the title, that's what Rebecca said to me after he'd been taken in the ambulance. And so that was the first question I had to answer from my daughter after the carnage. And so that's the title of the book. And incredibly bittersweet. I didn't sit down and write that for an audience. I sat down and wrote it because I wanted to tell our story. I wanted to create a legacy for the both of them, actually, and to make sure there was a real family's record of the pandemic. I feel at the moment it's been consigned to history books and we don't really talk about it anymore. It's this weird thing that happened. And so for me, I felt it was important to have that legacy, that record of the pandemic. But as you say, it's incredibly bittersweet because I've only written it because of what happened to my family. I'd never.
Yeah, but at the same time, you're ensuring, which is what you set out to do, that Stuart or Charlie wasn't just a statistic of, because so many numbers and so many people and the young families like yours that were affected, that should be remembered as a name and not just a number.
Yeah. And I think it's that, the media, and I completely understand why, became very fixated on numbers. And it would be 450 people died today, 1,200 people tested positive. But every one of those numbers was a person with a story and a family. And I just felt it was important to, as I say, tell our story.
How are you and Rebecca today?
We are... you grow around grief, I think is the best way to describe it. So grief is still very much part of our lives. Last year for the 5th anniversary, both of us really struggled with that. It felt like this milestone moment.
Because you're moving further away from...
We're moving further away. This year's a bit funny. Everything falls on the same day as it did in 2020, which I didn't realise happens after 6 years, but it does. Like Charlie died on a Sunday and it's a Sunday this year. So grief is still very much part of our life. But we are, we are growing around it. We are living our lives. I've become a trustee for the charity Widowed and Young. She does her GCSEs this year.
Wow.
She's, you know, we've grown around it. And, you know, I couldn't sit here now and tell you I have a bad life, because we don't. You know, we've grown around it. We've spent a lot of time in therapy, the two of us, to help us get to this point as well. But life does, and I think that's the biggest learning, isn't it? You know, life carries on, and we've had to carry on with grief as like a constant companion to us. But yeah, life is, it's really hard. Like I say, I don't want to say we have a bad life, because we don't. But
it's a different life.
It's a different life, and it's not the life that we planned. It's certainly not the life I would have chosen for her. But our life, you know, we're doing okay.
Emma, like you've done through your writing, you've given a lot of hope. You've also, you know, for many people who've lost their other person young, and perhaps had this life that we didn't expect. You know, it's nice sort of companionship reading what you write.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's lovely. I think you really are helping other people.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Grief Pod with Venetia Quick. You can listen on SoundCloud or wherever you get your podcasts. We also have an online community on Facebook, The Grief Pod, or on Instagram @GriefPod Series.